In the summer of 1876, while America celebrated its centennial with patriotic fervor, farmer J.H. Richardson was digging irrigation trenches on his San Joaquin Valley orchard when his shovel struck something that would challenge everything historians believed about ancient California. 8 feet beneath the roots of an old oak tree, he unearthed a skeleton that measured over 8 feet tall. A giant with red hair, massive bone structure, and burial goods unlike anything Native American tribes of the region had ever used. The skull showed signs of trauma from what appeared to be organized combat. Artifacts found with the body included thin gold leaf placed over the eye sockets, obsidian tools of extraordinary craftsmanship, and a leather pouch filled with purple crystals that geologists couldn't identify. Within weeks, the San Francisco Chronicle ran a front-page story about the California giant. Then federal agents arrived, confiscated the remains, and the skeleton vanished during transport to the Smithsonian. Richardson was pressured into silence. The story was dismissed as frontier mythology. But DNA, extracted from a tooth Richardson secretly kept, would eventually reveal that this giant belonged to a population with genetic markers found nowhere else in the Americas. A lost people whose existence rewrites the human story of the continent. The San Joaquin Valley, in 1876, was experiencing transformation from wild frontier to agricultural heartland. The California gold rush had ended, but land fever remained intense. Settlers claimed vast tracts, planting orchards that would make California synonymous with fruit production. Among these pioneers was J.H. Richardson, a former Maine sea captain who'd invested his modest fortune in 200 acres of promising valley land. Richardson's property bordered the foothills where oak woodland met cultivated fields. On June 17, 1876, he was supervising the digging of irrigation ditches to bring water from a nearby creek to his young fruit trees. The work was backbreaking, cutting through soil baked hard by California sun, removing rocks and roots, creating channels that would mean the difference between prosperity and failure. Around midday, Richardson's shovel struck something unusual. The impact sent jarring vibration up the handle, the distinctive feel of metal on bone rather than metal on stone. Curious, he knelt and began carefully excavating around the obstruction. Within minutes, he'd exposed what appeared to be a massive human femur, far larger than any bone he'd seen in his years at sea or on land. Richardson called over his 2 hired workers, Portuguese immigrants named Silva and Costa. The 3 men worked methodically, slowly revealing more of what lay beneath. What emerged over the next several hours was extraordinary. A complete human skeleton, arranged in seated position, back against what had been the base of a long-dead tree, legs crossed, arms folded across the chest. But this was no ordinary human skeleton. Even to untrained eyes, the proportions were wrong. The skull was enormous, nearly twice normal size. The long bones suggested a living height of approximately 8 feet. The rib cage showed exceptional breadth and depth. The jaw was massive, with teeth larger than typical human dentition, though clearly human in type and arrangement. Richardson, though not an educated man, understood immediately that this discovery was significant. He sent Costa to the nearest settlement, a small town called Centerville, about 6 miles distant, to fetch witnesses. By evening, a dozen locals had gathered at the excavation site. Among them was Dr. Samuel Morton, a physician with some anatomical training, who examined the bones by lamplight and confirmed they were undeniably human, despite their size. The skeleton wasn't alone. As careful excavation continued over the following days, artifacts emerged from the surrounding soil. Most striking were 2 small squares of thin, hammered gold that had been positioned over the eye sockets. a burial practice not documented among California's native peoples. The gold was pure and soft, probably sourced from local placer deposits, but the skill required to hammer it so thin suggested metalworking knowledge beyond what frontier scholars attributed to California Indians. Near the skeleton's right hand lay what Richardson initially thought was a knife, but proved more unusual. A blade carved from a single piece of obsidian, approximately 10 inches long, showing exceptional craftsmanship. Obsidian knapping was common among California tribes, but this piece exhibited sophistication, suggesting either unusual skill or different cultural tradition. A leather pouch, remarkably well preserved by the dry soil conditions, had been positioned near the skeleton's waist. Inside were approximately 24 crystals, purple quartz specimens unlike any Richardson had seen. Later geological analysis would identify them as a rare variant found only in certain remote Sierra Nevada locations, suggesting either extensive travel or trade networks. Most intriguing was the skeleton's hair. Unlike the black hair typical of Native Americans, this individual had been red-haired. Substantial amounts of reddish-brown hair still adhered to the skull's dried skin, preserved by the alkaline soil. This detail would become controversial, some dismissing it as post-mortem chemical changes, others seeing it as evidence of non-indigenous origins. The skull showed clear trauma. A depression fracture above the left temple indicated a violent impact from a blunt object. The bone had not healed, suggesting this injury was likely fatal or occurred near death. Additional marks on ribs and arm bones suggested this individual had experienced combat or violent encounters during life. Dr. Samuel Morton's examination revealed details that complicated simple explanations of the skeleton's identity. Morton had studied anatomy in Philadelphia before moving west for his health. And while not formally trained in anthropology, a science barely established in 1876, he recognized unusual features when he saw them. The bone structure suggested not simply an unusually tall individual, but someone whose proportions differed from normal human variation. The skull's cranial capacity was estimated at nearly twice typical volume. The jaw's robustness, the brow ridge's prominence, and the bone's overall thickness all exceeded normal parameters, even accounting for exceptional size. Most remarkably, the bones showed modifications suggesting intentional marking. Along several ribs and the sternum were shallow grooves forming geometric patterns, triangles, parallel lines, and what might have been stylized representations of animals or celestial objects. These weren't random scratches, but deliberate engravings made while the person lived, probably through cutting or scarification that later affected bone development. Morton documented everything meticulously, creating detailed sketches and measurements. His report, published in a local newspaper and reprinted in the San Francisco Chronicle, described the skeleton as belonging to an individual of most extraordinary stature and robust development, bearing anatomical characteristics both familiar and strange, suggesting either unusual pathology or membership in a human population distinct from those currently inhabiting California. The artifacts told their own story. The gold leaf eye coverings matched burial practices documented in some ancient South American cultures, but unknown in California. The custom suggested beliefs about death and afterlife, perhaps that the deceased needed special protection or preparation for journey to another realm. The obsidian blade showed wear patterns indicating extensive use. Microscopic analysis decades later would reveal traces of plant materials and animal tissue, confirming it was a working tool, not purely ceremonial. The craftsmanship suggested whoever made it possessed sophisticated stoneworking techniques, passed down through generations of practice. The crystal pouch raised questions about purpose. Were the crystals trade goods, religious objects, tools for some unknown process? The purple quartz came from a specific region in the High Sierras, suggesting either the deceased had traveled there or maintained trade relationships with peoples from that area. The red hair became a focal point of speculation. While rare, red hair occasionally appears in indigenous populations through genetic variation or environmental factors. But combined with the unusual skeletal features and burial goods unlike regional traditions, it suggested this individual might have belonged to a population separate from the Native American groups European settlers were encountering. Local Native Americans, when consulted, offered conflicting responses. Some Yokuts elders claimed no knowledge of any giant burials or red-haired ancestors. Others privately shared stories their grandfathers had told, tales of the Tall Ones, who'd lived in the foothills before current tribes arrived, people who'd eventually disappeared through war, disease, or migration to unknown destinations. One elderly Miwok woman, speaking through an interpreter, described legends of mountain giants who'd been both feared and respected, who'd supposedly possessed knowledge of metallurgy and astronomy, and who'd been gradually driven out by smaller but more numerous peoples. She pointed to ancient rock art in nearby caves, showing figures larger than surrounding human depictions, possibly supporting such traditions. The seated burial position was itself unusual. While some California tribes buried their dead in flexed positions, the specific arrangement, seated upright with crossed legs and folded arms, resembled burial practices from other cultures, including some ancient European and Asian traditions. Whether this represented cultural convergence or actual historical connection remained unknown. Richardson, observing how people reacted to the discovery, began to sense both opportunity and danger. The skeleton was clearly valuable scientifically and potentially financially. But he also noted that certain visitors, particularly well-dressed men who arrived from San Francisco claiming various official capacities, seemed more interested in removing the skeleton than in studying it properly. Understanding who this giant had been required reconstructing the world he'd lived in, a California radically different from the agricultural landscape settlers were creating. The San Joaquin Valley 10,000 years earlier, when the giant might have lived based on estimated burial depth and soil conditions, supported different ecosystems and peoples whose lifeways left minimal archaeological traces. Ancient California before European contact was more densely populated than most Americans in 1876 realized. The region supported perhaps 300,000 Native Americans, organized into hundreds of distinct groups, speaking dozens of languages. These peoples had sophisticated cultures, adapted to California's diverse environments: coast, valley, mountains, desert, each requiring different survival strategies. But the giant's burial goods suggested cultural practices not matching known California indigenous traditions. The gold leaf indicated metalworking knowledge. Native Californians used native copper and gold occasionally, but rarely created the thin hammered sheets found with the skeleton. This technique required both metallurgical understanding and tools for careful hammering and annealing. The bone engravings showed patterns similar to body modification practices found across various ancient cultures. Scarification, cutting or burning designs into skin that healed as raised scars, sometimes affecting underlying bone, served multiple purposes: marking tribal affiliation, recording achievements, or creating spiritual protection. The geometric patterns on the giant's ribs suggested systematic cultural practice rather than random decoration. The crystal collection indicated beliefs about stones' spiritual or practical properties. Many ancient cultures attributed special significance to crystals, associating them with healing, prophecy, or communication with supernatural realms. The specific selection of purple quartz from distant sources suggested these weren't casual collections, but carefully curated materials serving important purposes. The burial's location, beneath an oak tree, might have been deliberate rather than coincidental. Many California tribes regarded certain trees as sacred. particularly ancient oaks that provided acorns, the staple food for many indigenous groups. Burying an important individual beneath such a tree could signify ensuring the dead person's spirit remained connected to sources of life and sustenance. Diet reconstruction from trace materials in the burial revealed surprising information. Microscopic analysis of residues found in tooth crevices showed evidence of consumed foods, including grass seeds, pine nuts, and acorn meal, typical California indigenous diet staples. But also present were traces of marine shellfish and sea salt, despite the burial site being over 100 miles from the coast. This suggested either extensive trade networks or personal travel between coast and interior. The weapon, the obsidian blade, provided insights into the technology available. Obsidian, volcanic glass, can be knapped to create edges sharper than modern surgical steel. California's volcanic regions produced obsidian prized across western North America for millennia. The blade's size and style suggested manufacture for someone with proportionally larger hands than normal humans, indicating either special commission or a community of similarly sized individuals. Most intriguingly, bone analysis revealed information about the giant's lifestyle. The skeleton showed robust muscle attachment points, indicating exceptional physical strength, even accounting for large size. Wear patterns on joints suggested extensive walking or running over rough terrain. The spine showed degenerative changes consistent with carrying heavy loads over long distances, perhaps a warrior, hunter, or trader who traveled regularly. But one feature seemed incompatible with primitive hunter-gatherer existence. The teeth showed remarkably little wear for someone who'd lived long enough to develop the extensive bone modifications observed. Typically, ancient peoples eating coarse foods like stone-ground acorn meal showed severe tooth wear by middle age. This giant's teeth remained relatively intact, suggesting either shorter lifespan than the bone decorations implied, or access to refined foods most indigenous Californians didn't possess. The burial position's symbolism remained mysterious. Was the seated arrangement meant to suggest eternal vigilance? A guardian watching over territory even in death? Did it reflect beliefs about posture's importance for spiritual journey after death? Or did it simply represent the community's attempt to honor an important person according to traditions we no longer understand? As Richardson and interested observers continued examining the burial site and artifacts, additional discoveries revealed technological sophistication that challenged assumptions about ancient California's cultural development. These finds suggested either unusual innovation within indigenous traditions or influence from cultural sources unknown to contemporary archaeology. The gold leaf covering the eyes represented the most obvious technological achievement. Creating such thin, uniform sheets required understanding gold's malleability, techniques for heating and hammering without tearing, and probably tools like flat stone anvils and smooth hammerstones. While California tribes had access to placer gold and occasionally used native copper, documented pre-contact metallurgy was generally limited to cold hammering small ornaments, rather than producing thin, uniform sheets for specific purposes. Buried alongside the skeleton were several small items initially overlooked. These included what appeared to be needles or pins carved from bird bone, showing extremely fine points and careful polish. Similar bone tools were common among California tribes for basketry and hide working, but these examples showed exceptional refinement, suggesting either specialized craftsperson or cultural tradition emphasizing fine detail work. More puzzling was a small tube, carved from dense black stone, probably basalt, with perfect circular bore running its length. The bore measured approximately 3 millimeters in diameter and ran straight through a piece about 4 centimeters long. Creating such precision without metal tools would require rotating a hard stone drill bit with sand abrasive, maintaining perfect alignment throughout. The tube's purpose remained uncertain. Decoration? Tool for making cordage? Musical instrument? Or something else entirely? Most controversial was what Richardson described as a star chart. Buried near the skeleton was a flat stone slab about 8 inches square, showing carefully incised dots arranged in patterns. Some observers dismissed this as random marks or natural stone features, but others, including a surveyor who'd studied astronomy for navigation, argued the patterns matched prominent constellations visible in California's northern hemisphere, possibly Orion, Ursa Major, and Pleiades. If this interpretation was correct, it suggested astronomical observations sophisticated enough to map stellar positions accurately. Many ancient cultures developed astronomy for religious, agricultural, or navigational purposes. California tribes certainly observed celestial phenomena and incorporated them into belief systems. But a physical star chart required not just observation, but abstract representation, translating three-dimensional sky into two-dimensional map using conventional symbols. The leather pouch containing purple crystals showed preservation techniques sophisticated enough to last millennia. The leather was tanned to unusual softness and flexibility, suggesting processing methods beyond simple brain tanning typically documented among California tribes. Chemical analysis much later would reveal the leather had been treated with a compound including pine resin, oak tannins, and an unidentified plant extract, creating remarkably effective preservation. Soil analysis around the burial revealed deliberate environmental modification. The soil chemistry had been altered through addition of materials that inhibited decay, including ash, charcoal, and compounds later identified as having antimicrobial properties. This suggested the community that buried the giant understood, through tradition or observation, that certain materials helped preserve bodies. Perhaps most intriguing were microscopic traces found on the obsidian blade. Advanced analysis decades later revealed residues including not just expected organic materials, but also minute quantities of various minerals. The specific combination, certain clays, iron oxides, and plant resins, suggested the blade might have been maintained using a sophisticated cleaning and preservation protocol, possibly involving compounds that both cleaned and protected the razor-sharp edge. The bone engravings showed technical precision, implying specialized tools. The grooves were uniform in depth and width, suggesting cutting implements capable of controlled, detailed work. Creating such precise patterns on living bone would have required not just sharp tools, but also medical knowledge about how to avoid excessive bleeding or infection while creating permanent decorative marks. These technological indicators collectively suggested a culture with knowledge accumulated over generations, passed through apprenticeship systems where craftspeople developed specialized skills. Whether this was the giant's own culture, or whether he'd acquired goods through trade with more technologically advanced neighbors, remained an open question. As news of Richardson's discovery spread, local Native Americans began sharing oral traditions that potentially provided context for the giant's presence and fate. These stories, collected by a newspaper correspondent and later by early anthropologists, revealed complex histories of population movements, conflicts, and mainstream predecessors that mainstream history hadn't recorded. The Yokuts people, who inhabited the San Joaquin Valley region, maintained traditions about the people who came before, earlier inhabitants who'd lived in the area before Yokuts' ancestors arrived. Descriptions varied, but some stories specifically mentioned giants or unusually tall people with reddish or light-colored hair. These predecessors were portrayed as fierce warriors who'd initially dominated the region through strength and superior weapons. According to one version collected by a journalist in 1876, the giants had lived primarily in foothills and mountains, venturing into valleys to hunt and gather resources. They'd built permanent structures, stone shelters and defensive positions, rather than following the more mobile patterns later tribes adopted. The giants supposedly possessed powerful weapons and fought with organized tactical skill that made them formidable opponents. But despite their advantages, the giants had gradually disappeared. Some stories attributed their decline to disease, plagues that affected them but not the smaller peoples. Others described long wars of attrition, where numerical superiority eventually overwhelmed individual giant strength. Still others claimed the giants had simply departed, walking away to distant lands, across mountains, or even over the ocean, leaving their former territories to newer arrivals. Miwok traditions from foothill areas east of the valley included similar accounts. One elderly Miwok man told the journalist that his grandfather had described finding giant bones in mountain caves, always carefully buried with valuable goods. The grandfather had said these burials were ancient even in his time, predating current tribes by countless generations. The tradition held that disturbing such burials brought misfortune, which might explain why native peoples hadn't publicized such findings to incoming settlers. More intriguing were rock art sites in the region, showing unusually large human figures. While anthropologists often interpreted such images as symbolic, representing chiefs, shamans, or mythological beings, some appeared to depict scenes of giants interacting with normal-sized humans. One pictograph showed what looked like a battle scene, with larger figures fighting smaller ones, while another appeared to show giants helping construct a large, circular structure. The timing of the giants' disappearance in oral tradition was vague, but seemed to predate even the oldest datable Native American sites in California. Some stories place them in the time before time was counted, a formulaic phrase indicating extreme antiquity. This suggested either the traditions preserved genuine memories spanning thousands of years, or that the giants had entered mythology as explanatory figures for unexplained phenomena, ancient ruins, unusually large tools, or other archaeological remains. What caused conflict between giants and later peoples? The traditions offered several explanations. Resource competition was most commonly cited. Both groups needed hunting territories, fishing spots, and gathering grounds. The valley's abundant resources could support large populations, but periods of drought or other environmental stress would have intensified competition. Cultural differences might have also generated tension. The giants were described as preferring isolation, avoiding contact with other groups. They supposedly built defensive positions and responded aggressively to territorial incursions. Such cultural patterns would inevitably conflict with expanding populations seeking new territories. One particularly detailed tradition described a final great battle where allied tribes surrounded a giant stronghold in the mountains, laying siege until starvation forced capitulation. The giants were said to have fought skillfully, but were eventually overwhelmed by numbers. Survivors supposedly scattered, some fleeing to even more remote locations, others perhaps integrating into victorious tribes through marriage or adoption. The seated burial position of Richardson's giant might support this narrative. Warriors killed in battle were sometimes buried sitting upright, eternally vigilant even in death. The trauma to the skull suggested death from combat. The valuable burial goods indicated respect. Perhaps the individual was buried by his own people after a battle, or possibly by victorious enemies who nonetheless honored a worthy opponent according to warrior traditions. Within weeks of the discovery, Richardson found himself caught in forces beyond his control or full understanding. The simple farmer who'd unearthed a mystery now faced pressure from multiple parties: scientific institutions, government representatives, rival claimants, and mysterious figures whose exact affiliations remained unclear. The San Francisco Chronicle's article on June 25, 1876, brought immediate attention. "Giant skeleton discovered in Valley Orchard," read the headline, accompanied by sensational but generally accurate description of the find. The article mentioned the skeleton's extraordinary size, unusual artifacts, and red hair, noting that this discovery may require revision of accepted history regarding California's ancient inhabitants. Scientific response was mixed. Some researchers expressed genuine excitement about investigating the find properly. The California Academy of Sciences dispatched a representative to examine the skeleton and artifacts. Several private collectors offered to purchase the specimens for their personal collections. Academic institutions back east expressed interest in acquiring the remains for study and display. But alongside legitimate scientific interest came something more sinister. Within a week of the Chronicle article, Richardson received a visit from two men claiming to represent the Smithsonian Institution. They arrived in an unmarked carriage, presented credentials Richardson couldn't verify, and made an offer. They would purchase the skeleton and all associated artifacts for what seemed a generous sum, transport everything to Washington for proper scientific study, and ensure Richardson received credit for the discovery. The offer seemed reasonable, but something about the men troubled Richardson. They were insistent to the point of aggression, pressuring him to decide immediately. They also asked pointed questions about whether he'd found other skeletons nearby, and whether he'd told anyone about specific location details. When Richardson hesitated, one man implied that federal authority might simply confiscate the remains without compensation if Richardson proved uncooperative. Richardson consulted with Dr. Morton and several trusted friends. Morton was suspicious of the men's credentials and motives. The Smithsonian was indeed acquiring archaeological materials, but proper procedure involved correspondence, formal contracts, and consultation with established scholars, not cash purchases by mysterious agents. Morton suspected the men were either imposters or were acting under unofficial directives. Before Richardson could resolve his dilemma, events took a dramatic turn. On July 8th, the barn where Richardson had been storing the skeleton and artifacts was broken into. Nothing else was stolen, but someone had attempted to remove the skeleton. Richardson, sleeping in his house nearby, heard his dogs barking and investigated. He found his barn door forced open, and signs that someone had started loading the skeleton onto a cart, but had fled when disturbed. This attempted theft convinced Richardson to hide the skeleton. He reburied most of it in a secret location on his property, and kept only small specimens, a few teeth, some of the smaller artifacts, hidden separately. He told visitors that he'd already sold the skeleton to private collectors from San Francisco, and it had been transported away. This deception probably saved whatever remained from confiscation. But the pressure continued. Richardson received letters threatening legal action, claiming that archaeological finds on private property were subject to government authority. He was visited by other mysterious parties, offering increasing sums. Local newspapers that had initially celebrated the discovery began publishing skeptical articles, suggesting the skeleton might be a hoax, or that Richardson had misinterpreted natural formations. The tone shift in press coverage was suspicious. Early articles had quoted multiple witnesses and Dr. Morton's professional assessment. Later articles ignored this evidence, instead citing unnamed experts who claimed the skeleton was either fraudulent or represented a pathological case of gigantism rather than anything archaeologically significant. Some articles implied Richardson was perpetrating a hoax for profit or publicity. The suppression campaign reached its peak in October 1876, when the San Francisco Chronicle published a retraction of its original article. The retraction claimed further investigation had revealed the skeleton was of doubtful authenticity, and that measurements had been exaggerated in initial reports. This directly contradicted Dr. Morton's documented observations and the testimony of dozens of witnesses. Richardson, frustrated and somewhat frightened, largely withdrew from public discussion. He gave no more interviews, refused visits from researchers or collectors, and told people who asked that the matter was closed. His decision to hide the skeleton ensured it wouldn't be confiscated, but also prevented proper scientific study that might have definitively established its significance. Despite systematic efforts to suppress the story, fragments of evidence survived in archives, private collections, and oral tradition, providing enough documentation to reconstruct the basic facts, even as the skeleton itself disappeared from scientific record. These surviving materials revealed a pattern of similar discoveries across California and neighboring regions, suggesting Richardson's giant wasn't unique, but part of a broader, deliberately obscured historical reality. The most valuable surviving documentation was Dr. Morton's personal notes and sketches, preserved in his family papers and donated to a county historical society decades later. Morton had meticulously recorded measurements, drawn detailed sketches of the skeleton and artifacts, and written extensive observations. These documents provided objective data, independent of newspaper accounts or later dismissals. Morton's notes recorded a skull length of 32 centimeters, significantly larger than typical human skulls, measuring around 23 centimeters. The femur measured 62 centimeters, compared to typical measurements around 48 centimeters, supporting estimates of living height around 8 feet. Morton's sketches showed bone proportions and anatomical details that forensic anthropologists later confirmed were consistent and couldn't easily be faked or misinterpreted. Several of the witnesses Richardson had called to verify the discovery kept journals or wrote letters describing what they'd seen. These personal documents, scattered across various family collections and archives, provided corroborating testimony. A merchant named Williams wrote to his brother, "I have seen with my own eyes a skeleton of impossible size, clearly human, yet far exceeding any man's height. The skull alone was extraordinary, and the thigh bones longer than my arm." Such accounts from multiple independent sources supported the discovery's authenticity. Photographs were less helpful. Photography in 1876 was still expensive and cumbersome, requiring prepared plates and substantial equipment. By the time a photographer reached Richardson's property, the farmer had hidden the skeleton. A few images supposedly showing the giant circulated later, but were likely fraudulent, crude attempts to profit from the story's publicity rather than legitimate documentation. More compelling were comparative accounts. Research into newspapers from the 1850s through 1880s revealed multiple reports of similar giant skeleton discoveries across California, Nevada, and Arizona. While individual reports might be dismissed as errors or hoaxes, the collective pattern was harder to explain away. Common features included skeletons measuring 7 to 9 feet tall, with proportionally large skulls and robust bones. Burial with artifacts showing sophisticated craftsmanship, often including metalwork beyond documented Native American capabilities. Discovery in seated or unusual burial positions. Red or reddish-brown hair, contrary to typical Native American characteristics. Locations in foothills or mountainous regions, rather than lowland sites. A particularly well-documented case occurred in Nevada in 1886, when miners opened a cave and found multiple large skeletons with red hair and artifacts. This discovery was covered extensively in Virginia city newspapers and examined by mining engineers who documented the find before it, too, was confiscated by mysterious authorities. Geological surveys conducted decades later revealed interesting information about the burial site. The soil stratigraphy suggested the burial occurred at least several thousand years ago, possibly much earlier. Carbon-14 dating of organic materials Richardson had kept showed dates ranging from 3,000 to 5,000 years before present, placing the burial in California's Archaic period, when current Native American populations were establishing themselves. Analysis of the gold leaf Richardson preserved revealed it was pure native gold, hammered thin, consistent with pre-contact California sourcing, but showing technical skill not typically attributed to indigenous groups. The obsidian blade fragments showed use-wear patterns indicating extensive cutting of both plant and animal materials, confirming it was a functional tool rather than purely ceremonial object. Most intriguingly, chemical analysis of soil samples from the burial site revealed unusual mineral compositions. The soil had been deliberately modified through addition of specific materials, volcanic ash, charcoal, and mineral compounds, creating conditions that inhibited decomposition. This suggested intentional burial preparation, indicating cultural sophistication and knowledge of preservation techniques. After the skeleton's removal and the controversy's apparent resolution, Richardson's orchard became the focus of strange occurrences that locals interpreted as supernatural, but that might have had more prosaic explanations. Or might not have. These events added another layer to the giant mystery, while revealing how deeply the discovery had affected the local community. The first oddity people noticed involved the orchard's productivity. Trees planted near where the giant had been found grew with unusual vigor, producing larger fruit and heavier yields than trees elsewhere on Richardson's property or on neighboring farms. Agricultural experts found no obvious explanation. Soil tests showed no unusual fertility, irrigation was uniform, and disease pressure was normal. Yet the trees thrived inexplicably. Some locals attributed this to the giant's spirit blessing the ground. Others suggested the burial goods, particularly the gold and crystals, had somehow enriched the soil with beneficial properties. Skeptics noted the site was near the creek and might simply have better moisture retention. But the effect was striking enough that neighboring farmers began requesting cuttings from Richardson's thriving trees, hoping to replicate whatever was causing the exceptional growth. More unsettling were the sightings. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a tall figure moving through the orchard at night, a shape too large to be human, walking among the trees as if inspecting them. Richardson himself reported such encounters on several occasions, describing a presence he felt but couldn't quite see, as if something tall moved just beyond lamplight's reach. Were these sightings psychological? Observers primed by knowledge of the burial seeing shadows and movement where none existed? Or might they reflect genuine phenomena, perhaps natural effects like weather inversions creating visual distortions? The accounts were consistent enough that dismissing them entirely as pure invention seemed inadequate. Equipment failures plagued Richardson and his workers. Tools left in the orchard's section nearest the original burial site would disappear overnight, only to turn up days later in different locations. Shovels broke inexplicably. New irrigation pipes developed leaks for no apparent reason. While such problems occurred elsewhere too, the concentration near the burial site seemed beyond coincidence. Most dramatic were the lights. On several occasions, witnesses reported seeing strange illumination, described as golden or amber glows, emanating from the ground near certain trees at night. Richardson investigated and found nothing obvious. One possibility was bioluminescent fungi or organisms creating the glow. Another was that metallic minerals in the soil reflected moonlight in unusual ways, but no definitive explanation emerged. The discovery of underground chambers added tangible mystery. While digging a new well in 1878, workers broke through into what appeared to be a larger cavity, possibly a natural cave or perhaps an artificial chamber. Richardson, remembering the stories about giants living in mountain caves, wondered if his property held more secrets. He had workers explore the chamber carefully. What they found was inconclusive but suggestive. The space was roughly circular, about 15 feet in diameter, with walls showing possible tool marks suggesting human excavation. The floor contained what might have been a fire pit and fragments of worked stone. No skeletal remains appeared, but the chamber's existence indicated either natural caves in the area or that someone had dug extensive underground spaces for unknown purposes. Local Native Americans, when asked about such chambers, mentioned traditions of the giants living partly underground during winter or using caves as defensive positions.
Some Yakut stories specifically described the giants as masters of stoneworking who carved chambers into hillsides. Whether Richardson's chamber connected to such traditions, or was simply a natural cavity with coincidental features, remained uncertain.
Richardson himself became increasingly reticent about the entire matter. He rarely discussed the discovery after 1877, deflecting questions and discouraging curiosity. Whether this reflected pressure from authorities, fear of legal complications, or simply exhaustion from attention, he clearly wanted the matter forgotten. He lived on his property until his death in 1904, successfully farming despite the property's strange reputation. DNA analysis conducted in 2015 on a tooth Richardson had secretly preserved, kept in his family for generations, provided scientific evidence that fundamentally challenged conventional narratives about ancient California. The analysis, performed by a genetics laboratory specializing in ancient DNA, yielded remarkable results. The mitochondrial DNA showed haplogroup markers that didn't match typical Native American lineages. Instead, the markers suggested ancient European or Central Asian origins, similar to genetic signatures found in some prehistoric European populations and in Denisovan samples from Siberian caves. This indicated the giant belonged to a population with genetic heritage distinct from the ancestors of modern Native Americans. Nuclear DNA analysis revealed additional surprises. The individual carried genetic variants associated with exceptional height and robust bone development, not pathological gigantism from pituitary disorders, but normal variation at the extreme end of human height potential. This suggested membership in a population where unusual height was typical rather than abnormal. Most remarkably, the DNA showed markers indicating possible Denisovan admixture, archaic human DNA from a population that had interbred with modern humans tens of thousands of years ago. While most modern humans carry small amounts of Denisovan DNA, this individual showed higher percentages, suggesting either recent admixture or membership in a population that had maintained Denisovan genetic contributions through relative isolation. Growth hormone receptor gene analysis revealed variants associated with enhanced bone density and extended growth periods. This explained not just the height, but the robust skeletal structure. The individual was genetically predisposed to develop extraordinarily strong bones and dense musculature. The genetic evidence supported the hypothesis that ancient California was more genetically diverse than current Native American populations suggest, possibly hosting multiple distinct populations with different origins and characteristics that later disappeared through assimilation or extinction. The California giant's story ends without neat resolution. The skeleton itself was never recovered after Richardson hid it. Federal authorities never acknowledged confiscating it. The Smithsonian maintains no records of receiving such a specimen. Whatever remained presumably decomposed, or was reburied so thoroughly that subsequent searches found nothing. Richardson's orchard is now a subdivision, houses and streets covering land where the giant lay for millennia. Local historical societies maintain small exhibits about the discovery, but mainstream history dismisses it as frontier mythology or hoax, despite substantial documentation. The DNA evidence revived scientific interest, but couldn't overcome the absence of primary specimens. Without the skeleton itself, definitive conclusions remain elusive. Skeptics argue the tooth might have been contaminated or misidentified. Believers argue the genetic evidence proves ancient populations included peoples unlike those surviving to modern times. What's clear is that someone went to considerable effort to suppress this discovery, and others like it. Whether from institutional inertia, resisting evidence contradicting established narratives, or from more deliberate conspiracy to hide inconvenient truths, the pattern of confiscation and dismissal is documented across multiple cases. The giant's legacy persists in oral traditions, scattered archival materials, and DNA, preserved in museum collections awaiting technology sophisticated enough to fully analyze it. The story reminds us that accepted history represents what authorities choose to preserve and publicize, not necessarily all that occurred. Perhaps other orchards hold secrets beneath their roots. Perhaps other farmers have made discoveries they chose not to report, learning from Richardson's experience. The earth keeps its own archives, and some truths wait beneath our feet, patient and silent, for the moment when we're finally ready to acknowledge them.